Hello, my name is Thierry Dubois. I'm a journalist specialized in airline industry, particularly for the magazine Aviation Week, and it'll be a pleasure to animate this roundtable on alternative fuels. When will they finally take off? The prototypes have been extremely positive, but in 2018 they've only contributed to 0.01 for demand in fuel for the airline transport. We have with us today Constance Thio at Air France-KLM. She is Vice President for Sustainability and Compliance. Claire Rais-Assa, she is Head of the Climate and Air Quality and Emerging Subject at the DGAC, the Civil Aviation Directorate. Paul Stein, CTO of Rolls-Royce, Rolls-Royce via Zoom, and Chris Raymond, also from Boeing via Zoom, who's in charge of sustainability officer. And of course, Nicolas, responsible in charge of prospective, environmental perspective and fuels and low carbon fuels at Safran. To start with, what could you define the roles of your company, of your organization in the uptake of alternative fuels by the airline industry? Claire, maybe you want to start. Yes, thank you. So, Claire, I am in charge, the Civil Aviation Directorate in charge of air quality and climate. Our role is to pilot and to kind of define the framework of the deployment of these biofuels in France. So the role is fairly outside of the value chain compared to the other actors here, but nevertheless a global piloting role. Constance, for the Air France-KLM group.
Thank you for welcoming me here in this panel. Great to be here. Reducing our footprint is already a priority for Air France-KLM for over 10 years, actually. And we committed to a decrease in our carbon footprint of minus 50% in 2030. And we have two big levers to do so, which is fleet and which is SAF, which is the Sustainable Aviation Fuel. Extremely important for us. And it's really great to talk about here in this panel to see what we can do together with the whole industry to make this really happening. Because indeed, as you say in your introduction, up till now, it's been a very small amount. Thank you.
Et vous avez mentionné un point très important.
And you mentioned the very important things, the things that we can do all together in this industry. It's not everyone on its own corner. We need to work together. Nicolas Jeuland for Safran. Nicolas Jeuland, I'm working within the Safran group. We are a major engine and for helicopters and plane engines, but also other equipments in the planes, being inner seatings and the fuel lines. So the job of Safran is not to produce the fuels, but as every manufacturer, we need to support all our partners in order to facilitate the arrival of these alternative fuels. Together, we're going to have two main roles. One is to remove all the hurdles that could bring these fuels to the market, certification, etc., and technical issues. And secondly, to offer technologies that would be as carbon reduction, less carbon emitting as possible, because they are more expensive for the moment. For one of the ways to put these on the market is to offer technologies with our airline manufacturers so that the consumption is extremely low in order to reduce the consumption and compensate the fact that they are more expensive.
Thank you very much. So I'm Paul Stein from Rolls-Royce. And we do aero engines and other power solutions. Our approach to net zero is to firmly get behind what we call the three pillars of aviation decarbonisation, which we've agreed across the industry, of relentless improvement to airframe and engine combinations, to encourage the ramp up of sustainable aviation fuels, which we're going to come on to at length in this discussion, and also to explore more disruptive technologies such as electrification and hybrid electric and hydrogen and things like that. And then we have an additional role because we're also a company that has a nuclear power solution. And so also we're looking, which we'll come back to later on in this discussion, of the role in nuclear power as one of the vectors to make sustainable aviation fuels.
Merci Paul. Chris, de l'autre côté de l'Atlantique.
Yeah, good morning and afternoon. Thank you, everybody. Certainly agree with everything that's been said thus far on the panel. I'm Chris Raymond from Boeing. As of about a month ago, I'm our Chief Sustainability Officer, but I've been in the company and the industry for the last 34 years. And Boeing's really had a big belief in sustainable aviation fuel, really since the inception, coming along now on about 20 years. And I just want to thank the partners that are on the panel today, because many of them have been with us since the very beginning of that journey. And I think that started with the 2011 first flight on sustainable aviation fuel. And, you know, back then we were talking about whether it was even possible. And with the help of the airlines and the engine companies and our regulators, we now know it's not only possible, it's very viable. And now we have to scale it up. So look forward to the discussion today. And thanks for having us.
Merci à tous. Est-ce qu'on pourrait maintenant...
Could we maybe, so that we really define the subject well, which is not obvious, what do we include in the term of alternative or sustainable aviation fuels or alternative fuels? Maybe in English, we use sustainable aviation fuels, so it's clear we're not talking about biofuels. We're talking about sustainable fuels. We're going to define these fuels by their impact on sustainability, not their provenance. So what we're interested in is not to know if the fuel is produced from this and this plant or in this and that process. What we want to know if it's sustainable or not. So we're going to find in these categories, of course, fuels made with biomass that is considered sustainable, but we'll also find other technologies. Paul mentioned technologies that are linked to the use of low-carbon electricity. We can find hydrogen power to liquid, so fuels that are made based on these fuels and carbon that is being captured, taken out of the atmosphere. And there's a global frame. There's no solution that is better than the others. We're going to have a mix of solutions with different temporal aspects and different types of applications. So all this is covered, and the idea is to really know exactly what is the best solution at the right place at the right moment. I would like to turn towards the other engine manufacturers. Could you give us your definition of what is a sustainable airline fuel or alternative fuel, as they say in French?
Incluez-vous dans la liste des carburants alternatifs?
Okay. So when we talk about sustainable aviation fuels, we talk about arriving at them from a number of different vectors. There are a number of companies that are producing waste-to-fuel processes, so either agricultural waste, bio-waste, and plastics. We're seeing a rapid ramp-up of early availability through that route. There are, of course, bio-processes through fast-growing plants. Perhaps in the future, we might see a lot more e-fuels. So e-fuels, as has already been said, involves perhaps the direct capture of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or the avoidance of CO2 going into the atmosphere from flue gas, and then using energy from a zero carbon source, maybe wind, solar, or nuclear, to synthesize a fuel completely. Right now, this is an expensive method of doing it, but what we're seeing is innovation and technology now coming into the equation. And I'm pretty confident that within about 10 years, we're going to start seeing a far more cost-effective route for e-fuels. I think one of the things we'll say about sustainable aviation fuels, there is no magic solution. We need all of the vectors. You know, so for some countries of the world that perhaps have plenty of waste available, they might take, like India, for example, they might take one particular path for sustainable fuels. Another country, maybe France, has got overnight surplus nuclear power. Maybe they take a different route. Other countries, maybe parts of the US, has got lots of fertile growing area, could take a different route. So I think what we'll see over the coming years is a variety of different pathways to SAFs. As long as they're all derived ultimately from atmospheric rather than fossil carbon, and they're compatible with aviation, it's all goodness.
Merci beaucoup, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Chris, are you aligned with what has been said?
As Paul answered.
Oui, oui, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah. So agree on the multiple vectors, and depending on geographies, those feedstock solutions may be different. And I think one of the things that Paul and all of us agree on is that those environmental feedstocks have to be just. So certainly we don't want our industry to compete with the other uses of land or water or these things. And I think around the world so far we've seen promise on things like in Brazil, sugarcane, or in South Africa, nicotine-free tobaccos, or depending on the continent, municipal waste as another potential solution. In the UAE, I think they've done a lot of experimentation around algae, and that's been a very successful approach because we can actually use fish and the waste from fish to be a fertilizer for these things. So those are the kind of examples where we have to think about the feedstock all the way through production and then upstream of production in distribution, and make that whole value chain as sustainable as possible. So I think all this has been proven now, and now we have to find the means to scale it. And I was just listening to Archie Young from the UK this morning, and I think he had it right when he said, now is a great moment because of what the world is experiencing. Everybody's looking for economic stimulus in various industries. And sustainable aviation fuel is an example where we as the aerospace industry are going to need to collaborate cross-sector with players, whether they be the fuel producers, the transportation resources, or the feedstock producers. So it's going to take multiple vectors and a collaboration amongst that consortium, which we're proud to be part of with all of you.
Merci, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. The point of view of the final user for Air France-KLM.
Interesting to know that our first flight was by KLM in 2009, and the biomass that was used at that time was used cooking oil. We still see that as a very sustainable biomass to produce SAF. It's really a good way to produce it, but there's not enough in the world. So I completely agree with what Chris was mentioning, that it's important with the different technologies that now are available to stack these technologies and develop them all to see that we can produce enough volume. For us, as Air France-KLM, it's also particularly important that the sustainability criteria are really very well assessed. So it's in the production, not only that it's, of course, certified and safe, but also that the production itself is not competing with the food industry, nor has a negative impact on biodiversity or on the local society. So this is what I really would like to emphasize. It's also really an important element that we assess when buying SAF.
Merci. Claire, pour la Direction générale de l'aviation civile.
Oui, merci. Alors, je partage tout ce qui a été dit avant par mes collègues sur le fait qu'on a...
I'm sharing everything my colleagues said. Numerous aspects that are open in terms of SAF. As far as the state is concerned, we want to ensure that the sustainability of the fuels that is being used by the airline industries are absolutely unquestionable. And in terms of French aspects, when we're looking at the deployment of these SAF, be the biofuels, advanced biofuels, or e-fuels, the ones we mentioned earlier on, I think the question of the sustainability is central here, and we're going to try to favor some types of resources to ensure that we have the sustainability. Continuing on the expected advantage of the SAF, I'm going to ask Chris first. Can you calculate the expected advantage for SAFs?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Certainement.
Can you valorize? Yes, it is. Can you hear me? Can you valorize? Can you calculate the expected
benefit from alternative fuels in terms of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, sure. I think largely we've used 80% across the life cycle of the products. I think it actually has the potential, though, to be greater. I think this will get into the topics that both Constance and Paul were raising about upstream and downstream of the actual production of the fuel. But when we get to some of these e-fuels, for example, and we can make sure that those feedstocks are being sustainable, the production process is sustainable, and then, of course, the use and distribution. So it all matters to get to 100%, but I think the industry has widely used about 80%. And I have to really compliment Michael Gill at the Air Transport Action Group and the assessment they did in Waypoint 2050, because I think they laid out some very nice scenarios about where the industry needs to get with sustainable aviation fuel based on that kind of carbon emission reduction. So 80% to 100%, and that will depend on the upstream and downstream processes.
Merci beaucoup. Qui veut rebondir sur ces chiffres? Réagir?
Who wants to react to this, 85 to 100%? Yes, I just want to confirm this is the roadmap we are following. It is not. It is fundamental for airline industry, for the airline transport, and this potential of reduction should be an interpretation by in itself by the sector, because it is fairly considerable. Yes, I would like to confirm the figures here. Nicolas, maybe? What is important to highlight is the fact that we need to look at the entirety of the life cycle. This is where the question is, as it's been clearly said, what makes the message difficult to convey, because when we look at the outside of the plane, the CO2 emissions by the plane will be pretty much the same as we have with fossil fuels. But if we look at the entirety of the life cycle, this is where the virtuous aspect is. First of all, there's already the pedagogic aspect. We need to get people to understand how it works, because it's not easy. And then there's a second point that is fundamental and that requires a collaborative work, is that we need to be completely in agreement with the definition we're giving to these gains. How do we put numbers on them? How do we calculate them, and that we all have the same ways of calculating them. There's lots of work that has been done in this area, particularly interesting in terms of OSCI, in order to get there, to have this global vision that when we're talking about a alternative fuel and a carbon emitting potential, that it be calculated the same way across the world. Constance, Paul?
What we see also for our customers, that they are actually quite well aware of the existence of SAF, and that it truly reduces our CO2 in the whole value chain. So we see that our customers are quite knowledgeable and also really ask and push for it. So that's interesting also to know.
Paul, voulez-vous réagir?
Paul, do you want to add something to that? To the how do you put numbers?
So you're asking, sorry, the translator's not working, so I'm working with schoolboy French. I mean, firstly, to come back to something that Chris said, we're expecting a calorific benefit from SAFs. So one of the sort of upsides of SAFs is that because current fossil fuel actually is up to 30% aromatic content. Now I'm getting feedback in my ear. So we're expecting to see about a 3 or 4% improvement in fuel burn, which means we can carry less fuel, which means the fuel will cost a little bit less. But just coming back to life cycle carbon as well, which I know was talked about earlier on. I mean, the current 80% figure that's used is a reasonable estimate because of transportation use and harvesting and things like that. But as we move into an era of e-fuels, where the energy source is going to be zero carbon and the transportation is likely to be done with hydrogen fuel cell trucks and things like that, there is no reason why we can't get to 100%. And so we shouldn't underplay the role of SAFs in terms of life cycle benefits leading up to 2050.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. One of the experiments we ran, our colleagues in Spain ran in 2015. To Paul's point, was we did a prototype flight. It was a small autonomous vehicle, but it used solar cells from space satellites which are very efficient converters. And we actually use that solar energy to produce the hydrogen, which was then pressurized and put in canisters and used to fuel the airplane. So it's that process of these e-fuels that if we can continue to scale that up, I think it does offer that potential.
Alors Paul, vous avez...
Paul, you spoke about something that's important is the where do SAF stand in sustainable aviation? Of course, it's not the only factors. Could you eventually, Paul, present us a complete panorama of what would be sustainable aviation industry and where do the SAF stand in this panorama?
So thank you for the question. This is to me you're asking. Yeah. Let's see. If we take the totality of a sustainable aviation industry, and I'm trying to give a short answer, I think we see 5 factors. So we see engine-airplane combinations, which we know, and I'm sure Chris will agree, that engines and airplanes need to improve something in the order of 20 to 30% of fleet level between now and 2050. If nothing else, to make the sustainable fuels more affordable, because the cost of ownership of these fuels will be a factor. And also, as we blend them, we'll need to reduce CO2 footprint. The second factor, as I've mentioned, is the scale up of SAFs. Now, we need 500 million tons of SAFs in 2050. It's an unbelievable scale. Some people have measured the investment to get there in trillions of dollars. And we talk about SAFs as if, we can just buy them from the store down the road. This is a massive industry that's about to start. And we need to get on to how that industry is kicked off. Another element of sustainable aviation is the use of novel propulsion and novel aircraft, but more for the short range stuff. So electrification, hybrid electric. I think you heard about hydrogen this morning. I'm not going to comment about the pros and cons of hydrogen. I'll leave others to talk along those lines. But even the supporters of hydrogen, I'm not talking about hydrogen for transatlantic flights. And that's where the dominant CO2 footprint of aviation takes place on long-haul footprint. Something like 80% of all CO2 is beyond 1,000 kilometers. And then beyond the flying machine, air traffic control, air traffic management, ground movement has got a big part to play, a few percent. And in the early years, we know aviation is going to have to turn to offsetting, not something we should support for long term, but some kind of offsetting has certainly been proposed by ATAG and IATA as a means of sort of taking us over the next few while. So that's a kind of portrait of how we move towards 2050. Now, I should say that parts of the industry are great sort of supporters of net zero by 2050. The UK has signed up to that through sustainable aviation. The US not quite, but maybe things will change given sort of regime changes in the US. I suspect within 2 or 3 years, we're going to have a global industry all signed up to net zero by 2050. That's my prediction. And then we're all focused on basically taking away all fossil fuel use by 2050.
Merci. Parlons.
Let's talk engines now. SAFs that we already produce today, are they entirely compatible with the engines? Nicolas, do you want to start? Yes. If there's one thing that the industry will not make any compromises is security. So the optimal security level that we have achieved will not be questioned, will not be challenged by the new fuel systems, the new drives. So there's a certification system that includes the engine manufacturers, the airline companies, the certification authority to ensure that all these flows are compatible with all the different technological requirements. We have 7 methods that have already been certified, up to about 50% mixes. These SAFs, you can already pump them into any kind of planes in any kind of airport without any changes in users, in levels of security, safety levels, in impact on the flying equipment. Why a 50% limit? It's a limit that is not a physical limit. We all work I know that Paul Stein with Rolls-Royce, they have a certain number of studies been carried out of how high can you mix SAFs with standard fuels. It's not a physical limit. It's just that when we started working on these alternative fuels, 50% seemed to be very high back then. As Air France said, the first flight, we did them 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. Back then, we did not have this environmental limitation that we needed to go very quickly to fight climate change. We know that beyond 50%, some questions in terms of compatibility, like joints, like seals. So we said, let's put 50%, and then we'll be sure that there won't be any problems. And once we reach 50%, we'll have time for that. But now we know that's sped up and that we need to go further, and we are working very hard to raise these physical barriers. They are not unsurmountable. They are just questions of design, question of technology. We need to design some things different. So we have committed at Safran in our cooperation with CFM and GD. The next generation of engines will be planned to be compatible with 100% of SAFs, and we're trying to work with means to make the existing engines compatible with higher mixes of SAFs. Paul, do you want to add your point of view to that? The existing engines, are they compatible?
A very good answer. Our position to date, where the certification body that ensures the safety of aviation only allows us to blend 50%, is history. It is true that some of the impurities in fossil-based fuels, the aromatics, are actually used to lubricate parts of the engine. So we have to kind of slightly sort of test or perhaps even modify seals in the engine, quite small things, in order to make sure it's safe running at 100% SAF. This week, we're running a 100% SAF test with fuel provided by Shell in one of our large engines. So for the first time, we expect that test to go successfully, and then that will allow us to move towards a certifiable fuel, which then allows us eventually to carry passengers in the aircraft. There's obviously a difference between just running a test and actually having a fuel that's certified and safe to carry passengers. But we will get there very quickly. This is a matter of 2 years, 3 years. It's not 10, 20 years.
Merci. Et alors, chez Air France-KLM, vous avez démontré que les carburants alternatifs...
At Air France-KLM, you have proven that you can use SAFs without any impact on the ground or air, on the operations.
Study in 2014 until 2016, the lab line. And we also, of course, shared the results of this study with the industry. The conclusion was quite clear. Absolutely no impact on operations, neither on the airport side nor for our staff. So we can confirm that it doesn't have any impact for sure. What is interesting, the news is indeed that we can go to a blending percentage above the 50%, because what we foresee is that the production of SAF will be ramped up simultaneously on all the different places in the world. And it would be extremely interesting, of course, where the SAF is produced, also to use it, not to transport it to another place, but use it. And if that can go through a higher percentage, it's a more efficient way to make use of this produced SAF. So that's very good news. Yeah.
Merci. Je me tourne vers vous, Claire.
Now, Claire, let's talk about production of these fuels. There has been a call for tender by the French government for the production of SAFs. The candidates could be deposed until July. Have you received serious applications? And when would this call for tender be realized? If you don't mind, we could go a little bit further. What is the role that these fuels could play in the decarbonification of the airlines and the airport industry? According to the range, the solutions would be different. We also wanted to add that there is also a question of temporality. These fuels today, they are mature in terms of their technology and in terms of their commercial maturity. So it's really a solution. We as a state, we see that as a short-term solution to reduce emissions by the airline industry. And that's why France has published a national roadmap for the deployment of these SAFs with 2% incorporation in 2025 and 5% in 2030. And in order to operationalize this roadmap, to make it more concrete, we call this, we launched this call for tender. We had about 15 applications, and we're very satisfied about this. By the way, then this was organized, and this was carried on. And of course, the answers are serious. They are serious answers. And what is really encouraging is what we note. There are consortiums that have replied to this call, and within these consortiums, we have the entire stakeholders of the value chain that are present, not just producers, not just waste managers, not just transporters, because we'll have to transport these fuels all the way up to the planes, not just end users, but the entirety of the value chain that is present. And that is extremely encouraging. That means that there is a momentum of cooperation between actors that normally do not have the same interest in terms of the economy. This is really encouraging. So, timeline, when would this, what could this generate a unit of production of SAFs in the coming months, in the coming years? Yes, we are looking at all the projects. We're quite happy of the fact that we can fairly quickly decide in the best time range possible, find modalities of accompaniment, that of coaching that be adapted to the project that have been presented, because very specific when we saw that there's numerous technologies exist, numerous resources. So we need to find the projects that are most interesting. SAFs are now in a phase where, one, the companies find them too expensive, but the potential producers think that there's not enough demand to invest in production units. Would this call for tender? Would this a way for the state to jumpstart the process? Yeah, if you present it like this, it's kind of what comes first, the egg or the egg, the chicken or the egg. But what is clear is that of course, we cannot use these fuels, SAFs, if they are not produced. I cannot say that the call for tender is not just for producers, for SAF producers. We really see these as a support for the entirety of the value chain that will define France as a leader in this topic in order to have a French production available to users in France, in French airports. So it's just wider than just the producers. For us, it's really a way to jumpstart things. Thank you. Will these SAFs be intrinsically more expensive? Nicolas, can you answer that? Yes, you need to know we are comparing apples and oranges, so alternative fuels with fossil fuels. So one, we are going to look at fossil fuels that are based on a resource that are exported, that have been developed for the past 50 years in refineries, based on raw materials that are, in terms of production, that are in Thames. We have oil wells that gush millions of tons each day. Next to that, we look at these sustainable airline fuels with processes that are still in early stages. We haven't got huge production centers like the refineries, classical refineries, with raw materials that are far more disseminated, far less intensive, as Paul said, in terms of volume at one stage. So there's this whole phase of collection, of mobilization of this biomass. Of course, there is the fact that we are ramping up these production units. The more they are opening, the more we can bring down the cost. But we also need to know that these aviation fuels, they are fuels of a very high quality, and we expect a lot of them. We ask of them very advanced qualities, and we will not back down on these expectations regarding these fuels. So that is an extra hurdle for the deployment of these value chains. The cost is superior, is widely superior. It's going to come down over time. Will we reach parity? No, I don't think so, not in the short term. So all the mechanisms that we're going to have to implement politically to support these value chains, they will be absolutely important to jumpstart the machine. If we just continue waiting for the prices to go down and the price of fossil fuels to go up, then we'll have to wait a couple of decades. I just wanted to ask Constance, as a final user, on the price. There was a time recently where fuel was much higher than today, and it did not stop the airline industry.
The fossil fuel price was almost 2 times as the price right now, and even SAF is 3 to 4 times or 4 to 5 times from the pre-COVID price. So it's really incredible. What is important to know is that 1/3, 30% of our cost in aviation is fuel. And of course, choosing SAF, you can tell the story towards your customers, and the customers do care, but the customer is also very price sensitive. We know that because we're working constantly comparing prices, and that's our revenue management system. We know that even for a small price difference, the customer will choose another brand. So for us, fair competition is extremely important. Therefore, we do believe that the only way to move forward is through a regulatory framework. And it could be a mandate, it could be any other kind of support, but this is absolutely necessary to ramp up the percentages of SAF plans.
Merci. Je me tourne vers Chris pour parler production.
I would just add that thank Claire for the efforts to try to build a consortium of suppliers. That's very important that the government signal that support. I think, as an industry, but as we headed into 2020, I think we knew about 14 different consortiums or fuel producers, and they were headed towards maybe 3 billion liters in the next 5 or 6 years, so 2025 maybe. And so you start to approach maybe 1% of the needed amounts of fuel. I think the accelerating that to 2 or 3% is what we, the industry, have always assumed can start to represent, the tipping point, if you will, of where the economics of supply and demand start to work themselves out. But to get there, it is going to take efforts that Claire outlined. And, what we've seen in the United States is places like California with the low carbon fuel standard. These regimes may not be perfect. They all have their pros and their cons, but they have started to enable real production. And I think if we looked at the 14 or so producers right now, some of the greatest volumes are coming out of California. And I think that's because they have figured out that regulatory framework that Constance just mentioned that will enable that. We'll make those frameworks better over time with the government industry help, but at least they got something started. And I think that's a really critical step. Even we can't let perfect become the enemy of good enough to help start some of these consortiums to scale production to 30 or 40 million barrels.
Alors Chris,
your company Boeing supports numerous projects, 14 of them, I think, of creating production units on various continents, Asia, Africa, etc. When will these companies be working? Can we talk about timescale?
Yeah, many of them are working now. Paul can add to my comments, of course, but many of them are working now. By our estimation, maybe 5 to 10 million or so gallons are being produced now, but that has to scale to the billions. And so it's happening now. We're all using sustainable aviation fuel. In our Eco Demonstrator program, we ran every single flight in 2020 on sustainable aviation fuel. And I think both Boeing and Airbus now offer customers the ability to take their delivery flights with sustainable aviation fuel. So it's there today. But as Constance mentioned, it's not there in the sufficient quantities to make the economics viable for the airlines, given the portion of their expense and cost structure that is represented by fuel. And so we have to keep scaling this production. And that's why I think we in the industry believe if we could get to 2% or so, 2 to 3% of the necessary demand, then we might start to see the economics start to equalize to today's jet fuel economics. But Paul, please.
Merci. Paul, vous voulez réagir?
Yes, well said, Chris. I mean, I have two comments. One, being a technologist, I have some faith that technology will play a big part in driving the cost down and availability of sustainable aviation fuels. It's very easy to see the future in terms of 2020, but this is going to be a huge industry with trillions of capital available from the oil and gas industry that is being repurposed. And that will bring about massive innovation. And I'm already seeing innovation in the biovectors. So synthetic biology is starting to work on ways of producing far more output per acre of planted crop than we can do today with any technology. And then, of course, the e-fuels vector, as we start to use direct air capture methods and electrolysis to synthesize fuel from the atomic level, where the feedstock is practically zero. And as we bring up the volume and the cost of capital comes down, which it is doing now, so we can see the cost of fuel coming down. So I'm very upbeat for the future of sustainable fuels. But as Chris quite rightly says, need to get to a tipping point where people are prepared to invest those trillions, because we can't expect another industry to help our industry, which is kind of what it's doing by producing sustainable fuels, without some certainty that they're going to get a return back on their investment. And that is why the methods that have been talked about of, for example, a mandated blend or subsidy at source. I mean, I know many people are proposing the mandated blend as the preferred route, which then creates certainty of market, which then creates the investment, which then creates the snowball effect to build up to the levels that we need and get the price down. I'm very upbeat that we can make this happen.
Pour rebondir sur ce que
To jump back on what you were saying, Constance, can you commit to quantities that would give the investors visibility?
Quantity is indeed really needed because, as was said, the investment to build such a plant is enormous. So you must be certain also to make the business case closed, that the SAF that is produced, that it's really used. So in fact, that's actually exactly the discussions we are in, also with the AMI, where we say, if we can commit to a certain quantity, then the business case for a consortium becomes much more viable, and then it's possible to really make the decision and take off with starting a plant, in fact. And for us, it's extremely important that this is happening in France and in the Netherlands, because our home bases are, of course, in France, and our planes are always coming back in France. So this is really the place where we fuel the most. Claire, you want to?
Claire, pouvez-vous nous dire si l'État peut...
Claire, can you tell us if the state can take incisive measures for the airline companies? Yes, it's true that in the interventions we've heard a lot about the need of a regulatory framework to help the value chains to emerge. There is lots of work being done on this at the European level or in French level. I heard the word mandate in at least two words here. So the idea of having a obligation of incorporation of for either consumers or end users to realize specific levels of mixes. I would like to say that from French state level, we really take into account the fact we have a proposition that is being discussed at the moment in Parliament within the finance law for 2021, and that aims at widening this program that already exists for the road transport, and incitative tax for incorporation of SADs in their fuels. So if they incorporate a certain degree of SAFs, then they would not pay that tax. So we're thinking about having a regulatory framework to this, this is not a topic that can only be treated at the national level, because there is a very international aspect to airline transport, and the European level initiatives like the refuel initiative within the Green Pact for Europe are absolutely fundamental, and we're expecting a lot from the French aspect. The first generation of SAFs was criticized because they were competing with food agricultural stuffs. Second generation, can we avoid this negative impact on the environment of these biofuels? Yes, it's true that the first generation that was criticized on the topic of competition was the foodstuffs, but also for other reasons, because they were of land use, of the impact on biodiversity, deforestation. I think that there's a true awareness now in civil society on these questions that forces us really to take into account, they seriously take into account the question of sustainability. Yes, it's true that the second generation fuels, we now say advanced fuels, since they are based on the waste, be they agricultural waste from farms, or forest residues, or straws, or non-recyclable plastic waste, or household waste. The waste issue is very wide. It allows us to take away some of the criticisms that we had on the first generations of biofuels, and so we think that they're really now there is a virtuous aspect in privilege them, in taking them into account. Nicolas, you want to add something to that? Yes, we can see clearly that these value chains that we have put on the market and that were basically based on the history of the land transport, a raw material that was easy to access, easy transportable, easy transformable. So logically, of course, these value chains have been used first. Now we know that they have their limitations in terms of sustainability. And if we go back to what we said at the beginning, here again, what we're trying to develop is not to develop biofuels. We want to develop sustainable fuels, not biofuels. And this sustainable aspect is fundamental. Once we have defined that the sustainability is the most important in terms of reducing our CO2 impact on the atmosphere, but also the absence of impact on the soils, absence of competing with other usages, and we put all this in a clear definition of sustainability, then, well, in the end, it goes to the sense of eliminating pathways that are not sustainable and favoring those that are more environmentally virtuous. There's been work done in order to develop these processes to help a different type of biomass, much wider, as was said, mixed pathway electrofuel-based e-fuels that are by capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, that also allows to counteract the land use issues. There's been research work on microalgae. We can see that in the end, these notions of sustainability that have forced us to move forward towards pathways that are more interesting, not just in the terms of sustainability, but also yield and profitability, etc. So we are moving forward. Does anybody want to comment on that, Paul or Chris?
I just agree with what everyone said. That I think the very first generation biofuels that came from from arable sources that could be used for growing food, that was just to get the industry going. Already we're into a generation of sustainable aviation fuels from waste sources, waste cooking oil, agricultural waste. So already we're minimizing land use that could be used for growing food. I really think this is a solvable problem, and it's one, by working together with the oil and gas industry, we will solve.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think the feedstock sources that everybody's referencing, coupled with the production process, there may be some feedstocks that are more expensive economically, but the process might be easier. And then there might be the reverse. Some feedstocks will be more expensive, but the process may be less expensive. So I think, working with the oil and gas producers, that's what we have to balance out. But I know it can be done. I'm sorry, Constance, I think I may have interrupted you.
No, it's okay. No, I completely agree with everything what has been said. it's very positive that there are several pathways to produce SAF. And I think also we should see it very positive that it's a new industry that can be developed, which is, again, also good for jobs, good for local development, and it's an opportunity. We should see it like that also. Of course, we have some hurdles to take, but it can also bring great value to society.
Merci beaucoup. Il nous reste 44 secondes.
We have 44 seconds left. Does anybody want to say quickly something on the cooperation with the oil and gas industry, well-established companies? Can we convert these industry to SAFs? In 2 words, yes, we can, and we need to, because we haven't got another choice. And it's clearly, when we look at the examples in France, we have very good corporations that have been established between the oil and gas industry, the refiners, the Swiss managers, and everyone in the airline industry. So yes, and it's going to work, yes. So we can take them along into the SAFs. Thank you very much. We are going to stop here for today.